He served a selfish princess who thought the world revolved around her, and for years, he made that illusion real. But after surviving royal tantrums and impossible tasks, Lit finally said, "I quit." Now, in a neighboring empire, he joins an academy to start fresh, only to realize his butler skills outclass every magic and combat technique around. From brewing tea to breaking records, this ex-servant is about to school them all. Will his quiet life at the academy stay peaceful for long? Let's find out. The story begins with a beautiful girl calling the protagonist Lit. She indicated with her hand where he should stand, who stood bowing low. The girl announced that she had changed her mind about her plans after the performance. She ordered preparations for a grand horse ride. The butler announced that everything was ready. The girl said that Katerina was not feeling well today. The butler replied that she was already completing all the preparations. The young man gestured for the servant to leave the room and prepare for whatever the girl had said. The servant ran out into the hallway and urgently began giving instructions. He shouted that food and drinks needed to be prepared for the orchestra. The maid replied that she would do everything. The servant shouted that their traveling partner needed to be summoned, even though he was an aristocrat. He shouted for at least someone to find out how many aristocrats had been invited. They needed answers. Another servant replied, "Okay," and ran down the hallway. At this moment, a girl in the room put her finger to her mouth and said she wanted something different. She announced that she wanted to go fishing today. The girl ordered that Katerina be replaced with Biro. The butler replied that this was fine. He went into the corridor, but the girl continued to give instructions. She ordered permission to ask the aristocrats. She reminded him that there were important people in the royal family, so he had to be polite. The butler replied that he would notify everyone. The girl said that if anything happened between them, it was the butler's responsibility. She reminded him that the orchestra had to be appropriate, and there should be no skimping. The butler said that everything would be taken care of. The girl said that when she returned, she would want something delicious, so she needed to prepare something in advance. She said that anything would do, even if she had never tried it. She added that she definitely needed black tea, and when she returned, everything should be ready. The butler replied that it would be so. The girl said that if that was the case, the butler was free to go. The butler said he was happy to serve. After all, he was her assistant. The butler walked down the hallway, while the other servants stood by the walls, awaiting orders. He quickly reached his room and slammed the door. He locked the door and exhaled. Only in his room could he speak his mind. He screamed that he had had enough. He couldn't take it anymore. He screamed so loudly that everyone in the castle turned to look. He was angry that the mistress's demands changed with her mood, and the mocking number of tasks she assigned irritated him. In anger, he slammed his fist on the table. The protagonist understood that if he didn't do everything he was ordered, the mistress would personally reduce his salary and vacation. The butler gritted his teeth in rage. He was on the verge of a nervous breakdown and decided to flee the castle. He tried to remember how many years had passed since he was taken from the orphanage to the palace. When he became a personal butler, his job was simple. Over time, the mistress grew and began to demand more and more. He had to constantly monitor her things, wash, and put them away. Of course, he had to cook for her. He had to give advice on domestic policy and political games. He simply couldn't talk about anything else. He was repeatedly forced to do dirty work. The protagonist could barely stand on his feet. The working conditions were too harsh. If this continued, he would simply die. The protagonist thought about it and decided to escape. The princess wouldn't let him go so easily. He needed to escape to a place where they couldn't reach him. He needed to flee abroad. He looked at the map and decided to flee to the Garuderudo Empire. The kingdom of Asurarita was a neighboring forest country, a potential enemy. In this country, skill was important, not race or social status. Since it was a hostile state, even the protagonist didn't know about the country's internal affairs, despite having been there several times. The princess wouldn't easily find him here. He'd been constantly performing her impossible tasks, so he knew a thing or two and could handle it. All that was left was to put those skills to use. The protagonist left his room. He knew the princess was with the nobility and her racing partner. This was a perfect chance to escape. The princess had strictly forbidden unauthorized entry and exit from the castle. The protagonist decided to talk less to people and be careful. He calmly left the castle. It was so easy. No one said a word to him. He wondered what was wrong with the security. The protagonist recalled a conversation with the maid about this. She had told him that Beck, the head of the guard, had already gotten into trouble for smoking. The head of the guard wasn't coming to work and was resting. The guard responsible for identifying dark mages reported that last week the new guard had gone berserk because there were no instructions. The protagonist thought, so if he raises the alarm now, no one will come. Beck is a really bad leader. The protagonist asked a simple guard, who is responsible for guarding the garden? He replied that Beck was, but he didn't know where he is. Again, Beck, who simply needed to be fired. The protagonist had no idea when the guards had sunk to such a level. If invaders showed up now, he'd have to deal with them himself. The protagonist wondered what would happen to the castle's guards if he weren't around. What if the entire castle was in danger without him? Even Monada, who was in charge of security, didn't care about protection. So there was no point in blaming others. He needed to get to work. He knew nothing about this stuff. If there wasn't enough protection, Monada would fix it. The protagonist smiled sweetly and decided to leave things as they were. He'd given up on everything. He was determined to go to the neighboring empire. He didn't know what was happening there now, but from now on he was discovering a new world. He didn't know what awaited him in these new places. He doesn't know what the new day will bring. The adventurer is free. The warrior is very different and seems interesting to him. A very interesting future awaits him. He couldn't wait for this meeting. Here it is, the Dogarder Empire. He has reached it, the capital of the Garrister Empire. The protagonist walks towards the main gates of the capital. He accidentally overheard a conversation between the gatekeeper and a young man. He wondered what the gatekeeper was asking for. The young man said that even if he had a letter of recommendation, he needed to quickly obtain a certificate for admission to the academy. The gatekeeper said that if he had a letter, he should tell him. The young man was Owen Rish, an adventurer by profession. The protagonist thought that if an adventurer said that, then it was no wonder there were so many problems here. He wondered, a letter for admission to the academy? He remembered hearing about this before. In Garrister, there are academies where they teach a variety of things. Graduates of such academies have very high status. The protagonist approached the men, apologized, and asked the gatekeeper if he could write him a letter of recommendation. The adventurer asked the protagonist who he was. The protagonist thought it was dangerous to give his real name. He introduced himself as Lilt. He said he was traveling the continent to learn how to fight. The adventurer asked why the protagonist was traveling like that. The gatekeeper said it was normal that none of them had such a letter. Academies are very important organizations, as they help cultivate talented people for the Garderudo Empire. Letters of recommendation or a diploma help one enter an academy, even if one doesn't have citizenship. Therefore, it's important to issue such letters only to those who are worthy. The gatekeeper asked if they both wanted to become adventurers or warriors. If so, then to receive a recommendation, they must either be in the military or have achieved something. Either way, without skills, it would be difficult to receive a recommendation. Lilt wondered if achievements were necessary. In the kingdom, he won a tournament for those without talent, otherwise the princess would hate him even more. A person's origin is hidden here, so it can't be used. He wondered what he should do. Owen asked if the gatekeeper doubted their strength. He showed his enormous sword and nearly hit Lilt. Owen proposed a duel between himself and the protagonist. The winner would receive a recommendation. Owen asked the gatekeeper what he would say to that. The gatekeeper responded, not so quickly, but agreed to a duel between the opponents. Owen told Lilt to pray for a free bed for him. Lilt simply smiled in response. Owen asked if the protagonist was in his right mind, and why wasn't he afraid of anything? Lilt replied that they didn't know who would win. They wouldn't know until they tried. He replied that he accepted the challenge. The gatekeeper declared the fight open. He said that according to imperial law, a public figure must be present at the bout to ensure equality. This was a mock fight. This bout would be conducted by a simple guard at the city walls and gates. The opponents stood facing each other. Owen suggested they begin. He extended his sword forward and told Lilt not to disappoint him. It would be quick though. The protagonist replied that he wouldn't disappoint the opponent. Lilt knew he was strong in spirit because he was a true adventurer. Lilt assessed the opponent. Owen was in excellent shape, and he was an experienced fighter. He had to be careful with him. Owen said, "Go." He rushed to attack and wanted to strike Lilt with his sword. The gatekeeper was indignant, so fast, but Owen noticed that Lilt had managed to dodge the blow. Owen thought the protagonist was good at dodging and said the opponent was not bad. Lilt noticed that the shockwave had torn his clothes. The protagonist noticed that the opponent didn't use magic to become stronger. Owen thought, enough of giving in. He fights only with brute force. He decisively rushed to attack again. He tried to strike the opponent, but Lilt deftly dodged. The gatekeeper thought Owen was strong, but he never hit Lilt. Owen was getting angry that the protagonist kept dodging. He might be fast, but that didn't prove his opponent's strength. Owen tried to hit Lilt again. He asked about the protagonist being scared. He asked to show him true power. Lilt replied, "Look." He quickly ran up to Owen, delivered several painful blows with his palm, and then a main blow under the jaw. He knocked the opponent's sword out of his hands. Owen fell to the ground. Lilt grabbed the opponent's sword and prepared to plunge it in, but the gatekeeper shouted, "Enough." He ordered both opponents to stop. Lilt plunged the sword into the ground next to Owen's head. Then he straightened his tie and apologized for ruining the look. Owen lay on the ground, completely confused. Lilt assumed a butler's pose and caught himself thinking that this was a very bad habit. Owen shouted that he gave up. He said there was no point in trying to force his way through. He reminded them that he had already apologized and asked to be allowed to stand. Owen sat on the ground and said that he used to be a famous bounty hunter. He admitted that he was the Black Swordsman Owen, no match for the protagonist. He asked where someone like Lilt had been hiding all this time. The protagonist thought it was wrong to say that he had escaped from the enemy country's palace. He asked again that Owen was the Black Swordsman. The gatekeeper asked, was he the Black Swordsman Owen? Owen replied, yes. He asked, hadn't he said so from the beginning? The gatekeeper said that stories about the Black Swordsman circulated even among adventurers. Everyone knew how he single-handedly dealt with 20 thieves with just a wooden stick. Owen said that the gatekeeper was greatly embellishing him. The gatekeeper said that Owen was cool and everyone knew about him. He announced that, in addition to the results of this duel, Owen would also receive an invitation. Owen said that was fine, of course. He asked Lilt what he thought about it. Owen said that if that was the case, then their duel was pointless. Lilt replied that it was okay. He said he had immediately realized how strong Owen was. He agreed that Owen was also worthy of this letter. The gatekeeper announced that it had been decided that Owen Rish and Lilt Reru would both receive an invitation to the academy. The protagonist thought that now he could be a citizen of the empire. He was very nervous, but everything worked out perfectly. He wondered what the princess was doing now. Had she noticed his absence? Because of her bad mood, she was probably blaming all the servants again. He exhaled, smiled, and thought what difference it made to him now. Until now, he had to work for others, but now he wanted to work only for himself. In the princess's castle, the cup with its contents falls to the floor and breaks. The princess screams that the servants are blind and stupid. She said she was just starting to enjoy the delicious tea. She asked if the servants really didn't understand anything. The servant tried to explain that it was ordinary tea. The princess shouted that she always tells them to add the same amount of sugar to the tea. She asked if she really must say that all the time. The servants exchanged glances. The young man apologized and said that this was the first time they had done this. The princess wondered if Lit had ever done this before. She ordered everything to be cleaned up and another cup of tea made. The servants agreed and left. She thought the servants were useless. Several days had passed since Lit left. The remaining servants were completely incompetent. They couldn't carry out most of her orders, and every day the situation was getting worse and worse. The princess realized that without Lit, everything was bad. Since he ran away, no one could replace him. She decided that Lit should be punished when he returned. She was very curious about Lit's whereabouts and what he was doing. At that time, the protagonist was sitting in the library, preparing for exams. Owen clutched his head and said that they hadn't warned him about this. Lilt asked what. He said that the entrance exam to the academy was difficult and that he needed to prepare for it. Owen didn't believe it. Only a week left until the exam? Lilt replied that it was true. Over lunch, Owen explained that his grandmother from the guild had told him about the entrance rules to the academy. The protagonist said that, although they had letters of recommendation, if they didn't pass the entrance exams, the letters wouldn't help. Owen replied that he wasn't talking about that. Lilt said that letters of recommendation were created for people from other countries, so for them, they were admission. Owen replied that an exam was required for admission. Entrance exams are held every 6 months. To enroll in warrior training, you need to pass 2 exams. There's a written exam to test your knowledge and a trial by combat to test your strength. Owen said Lilt had proven his strength. The problem was the written exam. Lilt replied that he wasn't well versed in the country's internal affairs. He asked if that would be on the exam. Owen replied that it was the main part of the exam because the academy trains people who are useful to the empire. Owen suggested skipping the introductory exam this time and trying again in 6 months. Lilt answered firmly, no. He suggested they start preparing immediately. Owen became upset and asked again, "Are you sure you're going to work?" Lilt replied, yes. He said they would pass the exam in a week. If they spent all their free time preparing, everything would go smoothly. Owen sighed and said he thought the protagonist was joking. Lilt apologized. Owen asked why Lilt was in such a hurry to enroll. The protagonist replied that there were reasons. He admitted that he simply didn't know what might happen in 6 months, so he needed to settle in now. He asked why Owen had enrolled. The adventurer couldn't answer that question. He inquired if Lilt had registered as an adventurer. Strength alone wasn't enough. He needed a catchy name. The protagonist asked why Owen was even taking warrior classes at the academy. Owen replied that he needed stability. Adventurers don't have steady work, and the food is bad, so it's better to enroll quickly to avoid all that again. Lilt said it was good that Owen had bought everything for him and was explaining things he didn't understand. He thought about how Owen spoke before he thought, a bit rude, but overall he was a great guy. Owen noticed the strange expression on the protagonist's face and asked what was wrong. Lilt replied that there were 2 days left until the exam. Owen replied that they had done what they could. There was no need to study anymore. 2 days later, the academy, the day of the exam. A man shouted to the crowd that there was an exam being held. To enter, one had to pass through the gate. Lilt sighed heavily and said it was all pointless. He couldn't read 70% of the text. Owen didn't understand what the protagonist was saying. He said Lilt had read those 70 books in the library. He had seen the protagonist read quickly with his own eyes. He had simply memorized the books. Lilt replied that he wanted to read those books in advance and memorize them completely. Owen said that was pointless. Lilt said that 3 days was not enough and he would have memorized everything. Owen asked, seriously? He patted him on the shoulder in a friendly way and told him not to lose heart. He had done all he could. Lilt noticed that there were so many wonderful people around. Everyone was of different ages, social status, and race. Owen said that this was part of the tradition. In this empire, everyone is equal, so his skills mattered. Everyone comes here, young and old, humans and half-dragons, the poor and the rich. At that moment, a carriage pulled up to the academy. A beautiful girl stepped out. Everyone around froze. Who in the crowd asked if this was Her Highness the Second Princess Melilla? Someone said she was beautiful. The girls said her skin and hair were so pure, she seemed to glow. The protagonist thought about how the royal family knows how to be reserved, but thinks itself better than others. He remembered that Kirikou was also a princess, albeit a bad one. If Kirikou were more polite, serving her would be much easier. Lilt scratched his head and stopped his thoughts. He realized they had nothing to do with what was happening. A buzz was heard in the crowd. There they are. There they are. He couldn't understand why everyone was so noisy. It turned out that in the crowd you can meet not only princesses, but also important people. 3 young men were walking through the crowd. A handsome young man walked down the center. He proudly announced that Beitor from the Myrto family greeted everyone. 2 young men shouted, "Clear the way. Master Beitor is coming." Lilt wondered if they were the children of local aristocrats. He didn't really want to deal with them. The young men continued pushing through the crowd so Master Beitor could greet Her Majesty. One of the men nudged a simple passerby. The man backed away, and a girl tripped over his foot. The girl flew straight at Master Beitor. She fell in front of him, and everything she was holding in her hands flew onto the aristocrat's clothes. The girl was frightened and begged for forgiveness. The men shouted in unison that Master Battersan's clothes were dirty. They shouted that this was unforgivable. The protagonist turned around at the noise. Owen asked, "What's going on? What had happened?" Lilt thought trouble had begun, but this was a little suspicious. Master Batter shouted that the girl would pay for this. He pointed his wand at her. Mr. Batter asked if the girl realized how much a set of clothes like that cost. He said that just one jacket was worth so much that someone like the girl could only dream of such a sum. Beitor was angry that the girl dared to stain the jacket. He shouted that she wouldn't get away with it. The protagonist thought the jacket didn't look so expensive, but the situation around her was tense. The protagonist saw that Beitor was furious, so he wasn't at all surprised that he could use magic. The girl was frightened. She knelt and bowed her head. The girl apologized, but clarified that the clothes weren't as expensive as the gentleman said. She asked why he exaggerated so much. Mr. Beitor became furious and yelled that the girl would pay with her life for her rudeness. He waved his wand and directed magic toward the girl. The protagonist and Owen rushed to save her. The girl was kneeling and motionless. Lilt knew that Beitor wasn't very strong, but everything was happening too fast. He doubted they would reach the girl in time, but at that moment, something strange happened. The girl opened her eyes and focused her gaze on the wand. It created a protective barrier around herself against Mr. Beitor's magic. The magic released from the wand curved around the girl and moved chaotically toward the crowd of people. Lilt was surprised when he noticed the magic radiating in different directions. He didn't understand what kind of magic it was, but he knew that the magic was about to hit the rest of the innocent people. Everyone around him was very surprised by what was happening. Someone shouted that it was dangerous here. Someone from the crowd shouted to the princess, "Be careful." In his head, Lilt replaced the princess. The protagonist slammed on the brakes, spun around, and rushed to her rescue. He ran faster than the magic beams. He shielded the princess with his body and deflected the magic. The princess froze in surprise and could not say anything. Lilt quietly created a protective shield to protect the princess. After the attack, the protagonist elegantly adjusted his tie and hair. He looked at the princess and apologized. Lilt asked if she was hurt. The princess replied that she was fine. Voices rang out in the crowd. Someone was asking what happened. Where did this guy come from? The princess was attacked with magic, and the guy came running and blocked the attack. It's simply impossible. Mr. Beitor asked who that guy was. Lilt noticed everyone looking at him. He wondered what he was doing. His body reacted to the word princess. This habit remained from his time as Kirikou's butler. But he wanted to break it when he left the kingdom. He knew a difficult conversation lay ahead. The princess apologized. Lilt asked, "What is it, Your Majesty?" The princess replied that there was no need to worry because she doesn't bite. She said she simply wanted to thank him. The princess bowed and said that he had just saved her from danger, and thanked him again. She asked for the brave man's name so she could thank him later. The protagonist was a little confused and replied that everything was fine. Nothing was needed. Lilt understood that if he stood out too much, everyone would understand where he was from. He apologized to the princess for being rude, but explained that he simply couldn't tell her his name. At that moment, he opened a magic circle behind his back to disappear unnoticed. He apologized to the princess again and disappeared. People around him were commenting that such a thing couldn't be true. They didn't understand who this mysterious guy was. Suddenly, Lilt appeared next to Owen. He said he was tired. Owen screamed in surprise. He said the protagonist had scared him. Owen asked about Lilt teleporting. The protagonist replied that he had just snuck up. Owen replied that he should do as he said, but Owen said that the protagonist was just cool. Lilt became embarrassed and asked Owen not to mention it. Lilt suggested that they hurry to the meeting place. Owen asked why the protagonist was in such a hurry. Mr. Beitor watched him go. Imperial Professional Academy. The auditorium announced that the written exam was about to begin. A girl in uniform introduced herself as Gillen, a lecturer and a major general in the Imperial Army. She said that she had been assigned to monitor the exam. She explained everything about the exam. They had 3 hours to complete the work. Answers to the assignments must be recorded on the form. At the end of the exam, she will collect all the work, as with a regular test. Cheating is prohibited. If anyone is caught, they will receive the appropriate punishment. The use of magic is also strictly prohibited. The exam is to test knowledge. The lecturer asked if there were any questions for her. Bator and his entourage sat in the back row. One of the guys asked him if it was safe to use telepathy here. After all, the invigilator had said that magic was forbidden during the exam. Bator replied that it couldn't be monitored. No one around suspected that they were using advanced magic. Bator said that everything would go like clockwork. The 3 of them, using telepathy, will easily pass the exam. Bator ordered his protégés to keep up with him. Lilt sat at the bottom of the room and sensed some magic behind him. He realized something was wrong. The invigilator said that since there were no questions, the exam would begin. Everyone in the room prepared themselves and began answering the exam. Culture, laws, history, ethics, wars, strategies, all of this is tested in the exam. The protagonist reassured himself that it was impossible. Task number 1. Write the name of the empire. Lilt was surprised that they were even asking such questions. He thought that he couldn't hesitate. There were still many tasks left. It would only get harder. He needed to show what he was made of. The invigilator was holding a watch in her hand. She loudly announced that the exam was over. She asked them to put down their pens and hand in their forms. The results of the theoretical exam would be found out after the practical. Lilt wiped the sweat from his brow and thought that the exam had been difficult. Everyone went off to the practical part together. Owen asked the protagonist how he wrote it. Lilt replied that he had barely managed it all. Everything was easy at the beginning, so he relaxed. Owen smiled and said that that was just like the protagonist. Lilt said that the last tasks were quite difficult. The exam conditions were as close as possible to a real military operation. Owen was very surprised. He asked that the protagonist answered all the questions. Lilt answered yes. He asked, "Isn't that the point of the exam?" Owen screamed that Lilt was laughing at him. He only had to answer half the questions. He explained that to pass the exam, you only had to answer a third of the questions correctly. That's the minimum threshold. Answering all the questions gives you 2,000 points. Maximum. That's genius level. Owen said that if the protagonist answered half the questions in that time, or even 2/3, that would be more than enough to pass. Owen said that Lilt had read all those books, but hadn't he read the exam manual? The protagonist replied that he started reading the manual last, so he could memorize it completely. Owen couldn't believe the protagonist was so smart. Owen clutched his head and said that everything would be fine, no unnecessary questions. All that remained was the practical exam. Owen hoped that the protagonist wouldn't have any questions there either. Lilt replied that they had to try really hard. Their conversation was interrupted by the exam monitor. Owen was surprised. Major General Giln, the girl apologized for the intrusion. She said she wanted to ask Lilt something. She asked about Lilt using some kind of magic before the exam. Owen asked, "What is she talking about?" Giln said she was confused because Lilt had answered all the questions. He had answered the first and last questions correctly. She assumed the protagonist would get a perfect score. There were very few people in the entire empire who could pass the exam like that. She couldn't believe it herself. Giln said the protagonist needed to be tested. She wanted to make sure he hadn't used magic during the exam. Lilt asked, "Magic?" Owen asked Giln about her thoughts, that Lilt had cheated. Owen was trying to give the protagonist some hints on what to do. Lilt was afraid that his score would be lowered. He understood that it would be difficult to prove that he hadn't used magic. It was easy to say that magic was used, but it was simply impossible to prove otherwise. It would be very difficult to convince the committee that he hadn't cheated. Bator interrupted the conversation. He apologized to the Major General for disturbing her. He had something to propose. Bator claimed to have seen with his own eyes that the protagonist had cheated on the exam. Giln asked if this was true. Bator replied that he, the 5th son of the Murdo family, had seen everything. Owen asked again about Lilt cheating. He asked if Bator was serious. Bator replied that he was absolutely serious. He and his friends could confirm this, and there was no mistake. The protagonist thought he was finished and in deep trouble. Owen pounced on Bator, accusing him of talking nonsense. Giln asked Bator for a reason. On what basis did he claim Lilt had cheated? Bator laughed. He asked if the Major General herself had said that it was impossible to get a perfect score on this exam. In that case, wouldn't it be obvious that the exam had been cheated? Owen shouted, "No, because the protagonist wrote it himself." Owen asked Giln if the test was designed in such a way that all the questions couldn't be answered, right? Giln replied that Bator was thinking about magic and outside help. Owen objected. Giln replied that it was simply impossible, but all the answers were correct. Bator and his comrades stood there with their mouths open, but there had been such examples in the past. Since the founding of the academy, such people had been few and far between. Such people were outstanding figures who left their mark on the empire's history. Usually, such people are very rare, and Lilt isn't as good as them. Perhaps she had jumped to conclusions. Giln told Bator about his mention of his family. She asked if he would go back on his word. Would he? Bator replied, "No way." Giln apologized to Lilt and said she would have to meet for a review. After various studies, another exam would be administered. The protagonist thought he was in trouble, but was it worth being so calm? At that moment, someone joined the conversation and asked them to stay. Everyone turned and was surprised because Princess Melilla stood before them. She said she would like to say something if they would allow her. Giln replied, yes, of course, and asked the princess to tell her everything. The princess said that on her own behalf she swore that Lilt-san was not to blame. The protagonist stood there, surprised. Owen asked what the princess was saying. Bator tried to stop the princess. Melilla asked what Bator-san was saying. Bator looked down and replied that nothing, but he was the fifth son of the Merc family. He had seen everything himself. He had seen the protagonist use magic. The princess said that it looked like it and she had heard everything. Bator said, then why is the princess trying so hard to protect this guy? The major general stopped the emotional Bator with her hand and asked him to listen to the princess. The princess asked again, why is Bator-san asking? She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, one of her eyes had changed slightly. The princess replied that it was all very simple. She had seen it all with magic. Bator and his gang gasped in surprise. Lilt was surprised too. Major General Giln explained that Her Highness Melilla possessed excellent magic. For this ability, she was appointed to monitor the abuse of magic. During the exam, the princess monitored magic and recorded those who used it. The princess said that people from families that had already demonstrated outstanding achievements were exempt from this exam. She came to this exam, even though she was from an imperial family. Did she seem helpless? Sweat appeared on Lord Bator's face. Bator said he didn't remember. Perhaps the princess had confused him with someone else. The princess replied that there could be no mistake. Magic detection had recorded precisely Lord Bator's power. There was no mistake here. Bator shouted that this couldn't be true. Could the princess's magic be at fault? The princess asked if Master Bator wanted to test it. No matter how many times she used it, the result was the same. Bator screamed, no way. The princess calmly replied that there was no point in making excuses and that all three would be disqualified from the qualification exam for cheating during the exam. Owen sighed, and Lilt thought about it. Master Bator's friends were asking what they should do, that everything was so bad. They begged him to do something. Everyone looked at the liars. Bator was ready to explode with anger. He screamed, what nonsense. He accuses the princess of insulting his honor and dignity. Bator pointed at the protagonist and said that everyone would soon realize he had cheated, judging by his work. Such a result was simply impossible. And he couldn't be wrong. He accused everyone of conspiring to humiliate him. Bator shouted that he had no other choice and would prove his innocence himself. Bator challenged Lilt-san to a duel. Everyone was surprised. A duel? Bator's friends tried to stop him. Bator rudely asked them to shut up and said he had no intention of retreating. He didn't care how, but he had to prove that he had been slandered. Lilt froze and tried to figure out when things had gotten so bad. A duel. An ancient custom instituted by aristocrats to determine the winner. Both participants put their family name on the line, and then the decisive battle begins. A true battle to the bitter end. The strong remain, and the weak flee. If one of the participants is from a military family, they use a system to maintain the balance of power. The protagonist had taken an exam on the history of the empire, but all that was in the past. The princess said that 100 years had passed since the last official duel. The opponents differed in skill level. Even the duels themselves were very risky, which was a problem. At the same time, laws were developing, and a judicial system was emerging, so now no one practices duels. Originally, duels were introduced for aristocrats, but Lilt-san isn't a member of any family, so he can't participate. The princess said it wouldn't ease Bator's pain of defeat, and he was being very selfish. Bator replied that he didn't care about anything. He said he didn't care about history, and both sides had to agree. Bator said it was his and the protagonist's problem. Bator pointed his finger at the protagonist again and loudly challenged him to a fair duel. He said that if the protagonist won, he would admit that Lilt was innocent. But if Bator won, the protagonist would admit his crime and disappear from this country. The princess was shocked. Giln stood silently. Owen asked if Bator understood what he was saying. Suddenly, Lilt agreed. He called Bator a weakling and replied that he accepted the challenge. Owen shouted that the protagonist was so brazenly accepting the challenge. He said that duels were no longer held, but they still existed. If he lost, he would be forced to leave. Owen began shaking the protagonist by the clothes and asking what he was saying. Didn't he understand that he could lose? Lilt replied that he was very pleased that Owen was worried about him. The protagonist recalled that it all started with suspicions of cheating. He had created his own problems. Owen replied that such arguments were unanswerable. The princess asked if Lilt-san was certain. She said that if the protagonist lost, he would suffer for a crime he hadn't committed. Lilt smiled and replied that everything was fine. He said that he had already caused the princess trouble, but it would be bad if she interfered here. Moreover, he had no intention of losing the duel. The princess replied that she understood that the protagonist would not back down. She asked the major general to oversee everything. Giln said that she wouldn't allow them to kill each other, but she would allow the duel. In this dispute, a winner must be determined. The princess said that they only needed a clear winner. Giln said that the duel would take place at the next practical exam and only then. Everyone's expressions were mixed. Some were looking forward to the duel, while others were worried about the outcome. The protagonist couldn't understand how a duel could take place during a practical exam. The Major General announced that the competition was beginning. The princess replied, "I understand." She said that this way the exam day and other minor formalities would be observed. Gillen replied that they would be treated equally during the exam, which was probably better. She asked Lilt if he had changed his mind. The protagonist answered clearly, "No." She asked Mr. Bador if he had changed his mind. Bador replied that he had no objections. Then the Major General struck with her cane and said that everything was decided. The test to become a junior officer, the practical exam. This is where the unofficial duel would take place. Bador stood opposite Lilt. Owen stood opposite one of Bador's friends. Opposite the other friend stood the very same girl who had ruined Mr. Bador's jacket. Princess Melilla and Gillen stood to the side. Everyone was divided into two camps, one for the protagonist and the other against. Gillen once again reminded them how the exam would proceed. The rules were very simple. The battle would be one-on-one. They had 20 minutes to fight. Each participant would participate in a training fight in an arena surrounded by a fence and magic. However, to prevent serious injury, protective and safety spells were in effect in the arena. Furthermore, to ensure safety and scoring, each pair would be assigned a teacher. Bador said the plan was to have a duel. Lilt said the Major General had come up with an interesting plan. He said everyone was watching. So, with so many witnesses, they couldn't cheat. Bador told Lilt he didn't know why the princess had fallen so in love with the protagonist, but now it was over. Now he'll show what he's capable of. He didn't like him from the start, and now he'll grind his insolence into dust. The opponents prepared for a duel. Owen raised his hand and asked, "Are you ready?" Gillen commanded, "Ready, set, go." Bador aimed a beam of energy from his wand at the protagonist, and ice shards flew at him. Lilt realized it was a magically enhanced second-class ice attack. He had already noticed that Bador was a good mage. Bador shouted with hatred for Lilt to get an ice shard. At that moment, a huge chunk of ice flew towards the protagonist. The protagonist managed to dodge, and the chunk of ice flew past and landed behind him. Both opponents considered their next move. Bador noticed that Lilt was doing nothing in response. Bador shouted that there was more. He suggested that Lilt try to dodge this, and he raised his hand with his wand up. Then several ice blocks flew at the protagonist simultaneously. Lilt kept his cool and managed to dodge both boulders, his expression unfazed. He didn't attack, but simply skillfully defended himself. Bador was up to something again. Bador shouted that Lilt had already dodged his spells twice, and although only slightly, that was something to praise. He couldn't understand why the protagonist wasn't doing anything. That's only a tenth of his true strength. He's scared, right? He could see that Lilt was afraid. He stood rooted to the spot, unable to even take a step. It was clear to him right away which of them was stronger. He suggested the protagonist surrender because now was the best time. He had a strange expression on his face. Is he so afraid that he doesn't want to fight anymore? Bador asked permission to finish the enemy. He used a secret technique, the military spell, Ice Lotus. The Major General told Lilt it was time to finish off the opponent. Lilt ran up to Bador in a split second and struck him in the back of the neck with his hand. Bador dropped his wand and fell to his knees. Owen smiled at the protagonist's victory in the duel. Everyone on Lilt's side perked up and raised their weapons. Gillen confidently declared that Lilt had passed the exam. She congratulated him on his victory. Lilt laughed. The Major General said she expected something like that from him. Both participants could pass the exam, depending on how they performed. Given what had happened, she could not accept Mr. Bador. She proudly shook the victor's hand and apologized for causing him so much trouble. Gillen said that Lilt had once again proven his innocence. Owen said that the duel had already ended, so he could let go of his guard. All of Lit's defenders began to push aside Mr. Bador's friends. Meanwhile, in Princess Kiriku's castle, a servant entered the room and announced that the agent had sent them a report. The princess sighed and replied, "Good." So, she had found her butler. Now she knew where he was. Princess Kiriku's memories. She met him about 10 years ago. It happened when she came to the orphanage as part of a charity project. Little Lit told the teacher he'd put everything back where it belonged. The old woman thanked him for his help. Mr. Brain noticed such a hard-working boy. He asked the teacher if he always works so hard. She replied that now she could be considered his assistant, not him. Mr. Brain was surprised. How could this be? She explained that she was embarrassed to talk about what Lit could do. He cleaned, did the laundry, made up the menu, took care of the plants in the garden, and put the little ones to bed himself. He also inspected the premises and equipment and submitted orders to the administration. Mr. Brain asked if they really entrusted such a little guy with so much. The teacher added that the afternoon tea, which the gentleman had praised so highly, had also been prepared and brewed by Lit. Brain was surprised, and she continued listing all the boy's virtues. The princess grew tired of their chatter, then got up from the table and pretended to go to the restroom. The princess stood in the passage to the kitchen and watched the protagonist work. He pulled up a stool to arrange the plates on the top shelf of the sideboard. The princess addressed him. He turned to her and was surprised. Was she alone? He asked where her escort was. The princess replied that everything was fine. If she didn't stay long, he wouldn't be angry. They looked at each other attentively. Lit apologized and said that he had been burning trash and had gotten dirty. The princess was surprised because she thought he was just cleaning. She asked if she could ask one question. The protagonist grunted in response. The princess asked why he worked so hard. Lit was surprised. The princess asked about being threatened, or was he trying to curry favor with this place, or was he just showing off his skills? The protagonist tried to explain everything to her. He said he didn't really understand because she was talking too fast. He clarified. Did she mean he was helping? If it was about work, then there was absolutely no need to worry. He wasn't being threatened, and he wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He was doing it because he wanted to. He thanked her for her attention because it made him happy. The princess was confused. She asked if he wasn't lazy. Lit answered, well, it depends. The princess said that if something was required of her, she wouldn't do it. Lit replied that someone had to do it. The princess replied that it was not her concern, but the adults. She asked if adults weren't supposed to take care of children, care for them, teach them, help them until they grew up. An adult's job was to be a role model for children. At that time, all the adults were running through the hallways looking for the princess. The princess said it was strange that children cared about adults. Lit looked at the princess with amazed eyes. He said that the princess was very smart and amazing. He was far from thinking like that, but she was a princess. She said he had a very strange expression on his face and asked him to get away from her before he stained her clothes. The protagonist dropped a plate on the floor and it broke. Lit apologized and said that he had gotten too excited. He realized that he should choose his words more carefully. Lit said that he hadn't thought about it that way. He hadn't thought about a sense of duty or responsibility. He thinks much more simply. A man once told him to be a good person and care for those around him, even strangers. If he made someone happy, he would surely find happiness himself. Little Lit didn't remember who said these words to him, but he remembered them for the rest of his life. That's why he decided to do everything in his power to help here. The princess understood his words, but she didn't understand what Lit was saying. She understood the meaning, but she couldn't connect with it. The princess believed that it's childish to believe such simple words. Then the princess thought Lit was pathetic, but a strange feeling arose in her chest. She didn't want to understand the words because of his attitude towards them. It was strange, but she didn't feel disgust. She didn't understand why she was thinking about him at all. Mr. Brain was running down the corridor with tears in his eyes and calling for the princess. She didn't even expect that he would find her in the dining room. Brain screamed that he was looking for the princess. He didn't understand how she could leave him without saying a word. Brain said that he was very scared that the princess had abandoned him. The princess tried to push him away and screamed for him to get away from her. Mr. Brain turned his head and saw the protagonist. He asked about his name being Lit. The protagonist apologized for not introducing himself earlier. Brain asked if Lit was alone in this room. He asked what Lit was doing with the princess. The protagonist replied that they were just chatting. Brain said that the protagonist was in bad shape. At that moment, the princess called out to Mr. Brain. She offered to take the boy with her to the palace. They were surprised by this proposal, and the princess said that she listened carefully and understood everything. Lit really wants to help people, right? She called him an eccentric who strives to help everyone and offered a simple solution. The protagonist tried to object. The princess said that from now on, he would help her. Lit was very surprised. Lit said that he was very flattered by such an offer. He turned his head towards the other kids and saw approval from the teacher. Lit turned to the princess and said, okay. He promised he could handle it. From now on, as the princess's assistant in the royal palace, he would do everything in his power. The protagonist placed his hand on his heart and thanked the princess. The princess said that this was the correct answer and welcome. The princess asked Mr. Brain to briefly tell Lit everything he needed to know after returning to the palace. She said that Lit should rest today and start work tomorrow morning. She asked that the protagonist greet her as soon as she woke up. Be sure to ask how she slept and if her bed was comfortable. Morning tea should be served, and on a cold day, warm clothes. Present tense. The princess woke up and lay in bed with a large teddy bear. She sat up on the bed, opened the curtain, and realized that Lit had not returned. The princess cursed and shouted that she would definitely bring him back. The protagonist opened his eyes. He sat down on the bed and said, "It's morning already." Owen said, "Good morning." Lit realized that Owen's expression was like he was lazy and couldn't get up early in the morning. Owen replied that it was true. He was used to getting up early and feeling energetic in the morning, a habit he developed as an adventurer. But to be honest, he never thought he'd see Lilt's sleepy face like that. The protagonist laughed and said he'd overslept and had a dream about meeting Princess Kirika. He couldn't understand why he'd even dreamed that. It had been about a month since he left the kingdom. He still couldn't forget it, as if he had anything to regret. Owen tossed the protagonist some new clothes. Lilt was very surprised. Owen said they were his new uniform. Classes started today. Owen asked if the protagonist had forgotten about them. Lilt quickly got dressed and replied that he hadn't forgotten. He said his new life was just beginning and he was enjoying it to the fullest. Owen clarified, new life was a strong word, but maybe he was right. They both went to the academy for classes, ready to show what they were made of. At the academy, they entered a classroom. Princess Melilla walked in next. The princess greeted him. Lilt became excited at the sight of the princess. She smiled and said that they hadn't seen each other in a while, although it hadn't been that long. They had been seeing each other often lately to go through the necessary procedures. Lit recalled the procedure for acquiring temporary citizenship, the procedure for entering the academy, and many others. He apologized for bothering the princess so often. Lilt asked what the princess was doing there and why she was wearing the academy uniform. Melilla replied that she was also a student there, which is why she was wearing the uniform. The students around her whispered that the princess was genuine, sweet, and had a bright aura. The princess smiled and asked the protagonist why he was surprised. Lilt replied that he was very surprised. He was surprised they had even met, especially at this academy. Besides, who would have expected the princess to be in such a uniform? How could anyone predict such a thing? Princess Melilla smiled and agreed, but she wasn't just there to see the protagonist. The princess explained that this academy trains soldiers. In other words, it's the closest place to the battlefield. This country is currently at war with the Republic of Celestia to the south. She'll have to participate in the war one way or another since she's a princess. That's why she decided to study military affairs, and this academy seemed like the most suitable option. In short, she decided to test the waters. Lilt was impressed by the princess's adaptability. Everything became clear to him after the princess explained everything in detail. The protagonist wondered if it was really necessary to approach him. He certainly understood that she had no sense of personal space or distance. But that wasn't all. She was clearly attracting too much attention. And considering he'd been involved in all sorts of trouble, Lilt really hoped the princess wouldn't cause him any trouble. Although, on the other hand, her presence could be beneficial. Of course, that was only the best-case scenario. If he could coexist quietly and peacefully with the princess, he'd be able to enjoy some peace. He'd already been in a lot of trouble since entering this country. Maybe now he'd be able to live a quiet life. He really didn't want the kingdom or Princess Kirika to know where he was. Princess Melilla reprimanded Mr. Lilt. She looked intently into his eyes. The distance between their faces was 20 centimeters. Lilt regained consciousness, jumped aside, and shouted that she was too close. The princess said that since he hadn't heard her, that's why she decided to call him that. She said that nothing could be done. She would have to repeat it again. Now they were classmates. That meant they were on the same level, so they should address her differently. The princess asked to call her simply Melia. Lilt replied that it was impossible. The princess asked Owen what he thought about it. Owen replied that he didn't think it was possible. Someone interrupted their conversation. When the princess turned around, she saw a handsome young man. He bowed his head, and the princess allowed him to kiss her hand. The young man said that it was a great honor for him to meet Her Highness. He introduced himself as Geek von Kalm, the first son of Count Kalm. He said that it was a great honor for him to greet the princess as the class representative. Melilla replied, "Thank you." She was glad that she had responsible classmates. Owen turned to the protagonist. Did he notice how easygoing the guy was? He wondered if this guy was sick. Lilt thought Kalm sounded familiar. He wondered if he was imagining things. Geek couldn't understand why Lilt was looking at him so intently. The protagonist tried to calm himself down. He needed to assess the situation. Come to think of it, there might be a reason. It's all because of her. Melilla, the second princess. The princess who, for some reason, had become friends with him. The princess decided to introduce the protagonist to an imperial aristocrat. Even though Lilt wasn't from around here, he had a sharp mind and decent combat skills. He was one of those people who got high scores on the entrance exams. Geek said, "So that's how it is. So the protagonist is definitely problematic." The protagonist thought it was expected. On the other hand, he was more surprised by the princess, who didn't notice his reaction. The princess noticed that Geek wasn't very surprised. She asked, had they already met? Lilt replied that nothing of the sort had happened. The protagonist wondered if they really did know each other. He remembered the Kalm family. Before the kingdom and the empire had become enemies over 10 years ago, they were aristocrats who had sided with the kingdom until the very end. Lilt recalled a banquet where both sides met. The young protagonist and Princess Kirikou were obliged to attend, but since they were still very young, they were bored. Perhaps they had met then? Did Geek really remember the protagonist? Did he remember Princess Kirikou's butler? Lilt realized something was wrong. If so, he was in danger. The protagonist thought that from Geek's perspective, the situation looked like this. First, a key figure in the kingdom infiltrates the empire. Second, he passes the entrance exams to the academy that trains future imperial soldiers and officers with high marks. Third, the protagonist rises to the top and earns the trust of the empire's bigwigs. Thus, he attains a high position in the army. This probably looks too suspicious. Naturally, Geek will consider him a spy or a double agent, and as an imperial aristocrat, he will want to get rid of the protagonist. Lilt wondered if he was right. Even if they had once encountered each other, would Geek remember an ordinary servant? Even if he remembered that the butler was present in the hall, he would hardly remember his face. The protagonist realized he was overthinking things. He decided to test his guess. At that moment, Mr. Geek asked if they knew each other. He said he didn't know how to say it. The protagonist realized Geek definitely knew him. Mr. Geek extended his hand, introduced himself, and said he was pleased to meet him. Lilt thought that his quiet life at the academy was over, but it was best not to show it for now. The protagonist extended his hand in return, introduced himself, and said he really hoped they would get along. The two young men shook hands, and a jolt of energy passed between them. Owen asked the princess what that sound was. Geek and Lilt stared at each other intently. The protagonist thought it was dangerous, and it was good that he noticed. After all, Geek could have killed him. It was good that Lilt had blocked the magic. The lightning could have burned his arm and half his body. Lilt concluded that Geek had attacked the protagonist, meaning he realized it was Lit. This meant Geek mistook him for a spy or a double agent and was trying to eliminate the protagonist. If this was indeed the case, this could cause a lot of problems for the protagonist. To continue living peacefully, he would have to avoid Geek. Mr. Geek said it was nice meeting him, but he had to go. Suddenly, Owen stopped him. He said that before Geek left, he wanted an explanation. Owen said he heard a strange sound. He asked if it was Geek's doing. Geek asked again, what strange sound? He said he didn't understand what they were talking about and asked not to throw around empty accusations. Princess Melilla asked Owen what was going on. Owen said it was hard to explain. When he heard the strange sound, he felt something familiar. He had learned to sense such things when he was an adventurer. It was a feeling of hostility. Owen was sure of it. Geek replied that these were unfounded accusations and personal conjecture. Lilt tried to reassure Owen. It's okay. Let him go. He mentally scolded his intuition. Geek asked if Owen had heard what he'd been told. He rudely told him to take his hands off him. Owen replied that he wasn't going to do that. He said that even if the protagonist said so, he personally doubted it. He wanted to continue the conversation. The princess asked the students to calm down. Suddenly, a girl in a hat interrupted the conversation. She said that today's students were energetic. The girl asked if everyone had heard the bells. Everyone looked at this girl. Lilt wondered who this girl was. Could she really be a teacher at the academy? The protagonist wondered when she had gotten there. How had he not noticed such a powerful magical force approaching? She apologized for disturbing them. The girl in the hat was an academy instructor named Iris. She waved at everyone, laughed, and said that if everyone was so stubborn, they would master her subject just fine. Iris said enough chatter and asked all the students to take their seats. The instructor, holding a broom, said it was time to begin the practical lesson. Owen and Lilt sat at their desks, watching the instructor intently. The instructor introduced herself as Iris Goldwain. She was a first-class mage, scholar, and colonel of the Imperial Magic Corps. Iris added that she was an instructor and asked them to show her respect. All the students looked at her intently. Iris said that they could end the introduction and begin the explanation. She explained that her subject was called magic practice, and it was very simple. They would simply use magic. The instructor said she needed the students to get used to magic as if it were their own fingers. They would practice until everyone could use it unconsciously. Iris laughed and said that she already knew that many of the students had experience using it. She said that perhaps these tests had been too deadly. There are probably some here who pass the exam thanks to physical strength, but there are probably also those who dislike magic. But despite this, everyone must learn how to use magic in class. Iris said it was a required subject. The instructor slammed her broom on the floor and laughed. A star-shaped object appeared in front of each student. Lilt stared at it intently. Owen asked what it was. Geek was surprised. What kind of stone was it? Iris said the students were half right. It was a stone, but not just any stone. It was a wisp of magic, or more precisely, a magical stone. The instructor said the stone had a shell and a core. The shell was devoid of magic, and the core was Iris's magic. If magic from outside hit the stone, it would begin to emit light. But this didn't work if you didn't aim for the core. Iris said many of the students knew their magic had no shell. Therefore, to destroy the stone, you had to aim directly for the core. The instructor's words didn't register in Owen's mind. His gaze was lost. Iris said that the students' task today was to make this stone and other things glow. The instructor added that while they were doing this, they were also supposed to solve problems from her special book. At that moment, a book landed on everyone's desk. The protagonist was surprised to see a book of math problems. He was even more surprised to see that it was the instructor's own book. Lilt thought it was all too suspicious, meaning there was some kind of catch. Iris told the students not to worry, because all the problems were simple and there was nothing complicated about them. She reminded them that the main task today was to focus on illuminating the stone. The instructor said that it didn't matter to her, even if they got everything wrong. But if the stone went out, they would fail. All the students diligently completed the instructor's assignment. Owen huffed and puffed, saying it was quite difficult. Iris said that concentration was key. She asked them not to lose their composure. The instructor said the students would have 45 minutes to complete the task. After that, there would be a check. Iris said, "Get ready, begin." When Lilt opened the book, he saw a picture of a naked Gillen. He thought he'd expected something strange, but not this strange. He remembered something similar in his life. The protagonist wondered if the rules in this country were that stupid. He collected his thoughts and decided to figure out the task. He noticed everyone was trying hard and keeping their cool. The protagonist wasn't surprised, because who would want to fail after all that time? Owen and Lilt exchanged glances. Owen shouted, "How can you be indifferent to the sight of such a half-naked girl?" Iris said she thought one of the students had failed the test. Owen told the instructor it was his own fault. He didn't understand if it was acceptable to use something like that. The instructor replied that she had gotten permission. Owen asked again, "What?" Iris said she asked Gillen to do this for the students, and she readily agreed. She replied that she would be willing to undress 100 times for this. Owen replied that this was going too far. The instructor started giggling and said Owen would be punished. Penalties were organized for those who failed the class. Geek asked again, penalties? He said they'd never heard of such a thing. The instructor replied that there was no need to worry because it wouldn't affect their health in any way. It wasn't really a penalty, but rather a natural reaction of the magic stone system. Iris said that when the students activated their magic would automatically maintain balance with hers. She said that if a student was distracted, the magic would fade and a backlash from her magic would occur. Lilt asked, what kind of backlash? Was that normal? Lilt turned his head to the side and saw Owen sitting naked. Everyone turned around at once. Owen didn't understand why he was naked. Iris calmly replied, this is what could happen to them. She asked them to be mentally prepared for this outcome if the others failed. The protagonist thought the instructor was crazy. Iris asked the students if they could be so relaxed. She said time was ticking even now. The instructor asked if they could make the task more difficult. She asked if anyone else was willing to show themselves naked. The protagonist thought they were in trouble. He imagined her to be something like this, but the instructor exceeded all his expectations. This teacher is too strict. Iris rushed the students. She asked who needed a penalty for getting 0 points on problems. Suddenly, glowing beams came out of Geek's mouth and eyes, and it became too bright. He was surprised that light was coming from his body. Another student's hair turned into a thick mane. Some guy shouted that the questions would kill him. The classroom was in chaos. Someone shouted that the book was biting. Someone shouted that the skirt was running away. Someone shouted that there was something sharp in their mouth. Someone shouted that there was an insect in their clothes. Iris looked at this chaos and smiled. Lilt thought it was pure hell. Someone was getting a penalty, and whoever was scared of it also got a penalty. Penalty caused penalty, and the classroom was in complete chaos. Even the princess had a flower on her head. Lilt hadn't had a penalty yet, but even he could get one. Suddenly, a crumpled piece of paper hit Lilt on the back of the head. He realized he'd forgotten someone was trying to trip him. It was the aristocrat, Geek von Kalm. He'd been in this state since the start of class, and he was slowly trying to get into trouble. Lilt was curious about Geek's exam. He noticed his first form was blank. Had Geek written nothing? Is he really sacrificing his grades to spite him? Geek showed Lilt the piece of paper and asked to look at it. The protagonist didn't like the aristocrat's expression. Lilt didn't understand what Geek was throwing at him, but he unfolded the piece of paper. It was surface-level thought magic, a technique for secretly transmitting information. The piece of paper had an identifying magical seal on it. Lilt remembered Brain using exactly this trick. The protagonist barely ignored the signal, but he couldn't help it and decided to join in. He heard Geek's voice, saying he had a lot of questions. Geek asked why the protagonist was here. Geek clarified that Lilt was from the royal chamber. Why would he be in the Empire? He asked what the hell was going on. The protagonist realized Geek knew everything about him and thought he was a spy. Lilt didn't know what to do. He knew no matter what he did, he couldn't claim it was true, and explaining everything would be difficult. There was only one way. Lilt mentally asked Geek if he'd made a mistake. The protagonist said he didn't understand what Geek was talking about. Geek told the protagonist not to pretend. He couldn't be wrong with someone like Lilt. He can't fool him with such a stupid name. That's just naive. Security question. What will he tell Lilu? Did he infiltrate the Empire to assess the army's strength? Or were they planning an open attack? Or had the protagonist abandoned the princess and fled? He hoped that wasn't the case. Lilt's body was dripping with sweat. He replied that couldn't be true. He would never do such a thing. But Geek replied that the protagonist couldn't lie. He was angry because he knew Geek would soon unsettle him. If this continued, he wouldn't be able to stay in the Empire. He didn't know what to say. Geek laughed to himself and said that the protagonist only thought about himself. Lilt asked, what? Geek said that the protagonist didn't care about anything that had happened. He said the protagonist abandoned his mistress and was living a better life here. Geek added that he'd heard the princess was capricious, but the protagonist was no better. He said that if he were in the protagonist's shoes, he wouldn't have done that. Lilt rudely asked Geek to shut up. Geek asked if these words had offended the protagonist. Lilt calmly replied no. Geek was just annoying him with his chatter. Geek asked if the protagonist denied wanting to be recognized here. Lilt replied that he hadn't at all and asked him not to jump to conclusions. Geek insistently demanded to know why the protagonist was here. Lilt rudely told Geek to shut up again. He asked if the aristocrat didn't understand simple words. Lilt snapped his finger, and a huge dinosaur warrior appeared above him. Lilt told him to shut up and let him focus on the lesson. Geek asked, seriously? He didn't believe the protagonist could use summoning magic? Only high-ranking mages could do that. Why could Lilt do that now? Geek decided he needed to defend himself first, otherwise the class would notice. But suddenly he realized no one in the class noticed. Even though everyone was afraid of penalties, the students simply didn't see what was happening. Geek wondered if it was just an illusion, but the dragon suddenly roared loudly. Geek created a protective shield in front of him. He cast baptism. The energy shield shattered, and an incomprehensible force began to destroy Geek's arms and body. When Geek regained consciousness, he noticed nothing was broken, so it was just a vision. But even knowing it was a vision, Geek was prepared for death. Usually, such magic can be easily broken if you get rid of the root of the magic. But there is the power of conviction. You need to be able to control magic well. Geek decided not to let Lilt out of his sight. He clenched his fists in anger and the crystal before him turned black. Geek thought to himself that he would expose the protagonist. He looked down and noticed the magic crystal was glowing. Suddenly, an explosion erupted from where Geek was sitting. None of the students even turned their heads in the direction of the blast. Iris smiled and loudly declared, "It's over." The instructor asked how the students felt. She looked at the exhausted students and said there was no need to ask. It was written all over their faces. She declared that now they had experienced it for themselves. Iris didn't regret devising such a task at all. The most important thing was that they all had fun. Iris said they couldn't stop there. She reminded him that she had said at the beginning that this was just practice, just a basic warm-up. After some time with her, they would be able to do this even in their sleep. She didn't want to hide the fact that there were students in the class who were already able to do this. Iris said she was putting together a list. At first, there would be a small number of errors, and then the number of completed tasks. Iris reported that Bella Bloodwood and Adolphe Arbonne were in 4th place. They made only 2 mistakes. The average is 4, so they're superior. 3rd place is Sarah Ains. She made only 1 mistake. Her magic control is quite good. 2nd place is Melilla Lira Gardert. She also made only 1 mistake, but received a higher grade for completing the tasks. That's talent. And most importantly, Lilt Lilu is in 1st place. He didn't make a single mistake. He received the highest score for completing the task. Without a doubt, he's the strongest. The protagonist exhaled and thought he'd done his best. Iris said that the students currently not on the list should work tirelessly. She declared that the lesson was over. Many students stood up and left the classroom. The princess said it was excellent. The protagonist was a little surprised when Princess Melilla approached him. She admired Lilt for not making a single mistake, despite the difficulty and the surrounding atmosphere. She said he had incredible magic skills. She wanted him to teach her how to do the same. Lilt said it was a great honor for him. He was pleased to hear that, but it was a great responsibility. He didn't know what to do. At that moment, one of the students joined the conversation. She wanted to ask Lilt something. The princess turned her head and asked if this girl's name was Sarah. The girl answered yes. She was honored that the princess remembered her name. Sarah apologized to the princess for her entrance exam. The princess replied that it was okay. She realized it wasn't intentional. Sarah said she had confidence in magic. However, this time, her expectations of the teacher were too high. Sarah suggested that the teacher had a bad personality in general. Lilt replied that these tasks with tricks were very interesting. He didn't understand how she came up with them. Lilt said that Sarah didn't mince her words. The protagonist was about to admit he'd cheated a little on the exam, and the exam had a task where they couldn't let the light in the stone go out. That was all they'd been told, so they had to watch only the stone and their magic. That's why, after the lesson began, he didn't immediately turn on the stone's light. He disassembled the magic contained within the stone, created a similar one, and placed it back inside. A magic stone is a stone that contains magic. If this is inside the original stone, a different magic will activate and the stone will burn continuously. Sarah was surprised and said, "I see." The princess said that after such an explanation, everything seemed logical. The princess couldn't believe such a thing. Iris laughed and said that such a thing was usually impossible. This stone was her original magic. She had developed it through a huge number of complex calculations. No one before her had managed to add mass to the magic itself. It's impossible to do this simply by looking at the stone. Iris said Lilt was able to do it in just a few minutes. She asked Gillen if she knew what that meant. Gillen replied that maybe Lilt was just talented. Iris said that could be true too. Gillen said it was good when the potential of talented youth overcomes the pride of adults. Iris replied that she hated this character trait in Gillen. Gillen laughed in response. Iris squeezed the magic ball in her hand and said that she would need to keep an eye on the protagonist. She was curious about how he would do in his studies. Most of the students were gathered around Lilt. Only Geek kept to himself. Owen asked Lilt if he had forgotten something. The protagonist replied that he hadn't. He thought the only thing he was interested in was why Geek hadn't made a fuss about his guesses about the protagonist's past. What was Geek von Kalm planning? It was a lesson that ended with some unease. 3 days had passed since then. Geek no longer pestered Lilt, but merely looked disdainfully when their gazes met. The protagonist was certain that Geek hadn't given up on revealing all of his secrets. The first week of school at the academy was ceremoniously ending. Owen shouted at Lilt that they were late and needed to run faster. Lilt replied that he knew about it. Owen said that this school was too big. It was about 2 kilometers from one building to the other. Lilt agreed with this, but said that Owen had spent too long in the restroom. Owen shouted that he didn't understand the combination of medicinal herbs. The protagonist laughed and said that it was strange to prepare a laxative in class that wouldn't kill you. Suddenly, the protagonist shouted, "Careful, man." He was trying to warn Owen that he was about to crash into a girl, but it turned out the opposite, and Owen fell. Lilt said to watch his step. Owen apologized to the girl. She extended her hand and asked if he was hurt. The protagonist looked closely at the girl in uniform. The girl helped Owen up. She said that if everything was all right, she would go. The girl left. Lilt wondered why the girl turned around and walked the other way. And when they collided, Owen fell. So she was physically superior to him? The protagonist wondered who this girl was. General Gillen asked the boys if they had met Miss Raven. Lilt repeated, "Miss Raven?" Owen asked what kind of cool nickname that was. Gillen replied that she was 890% sure it was her. Miss Raven is rare at the academy, and the boys were very lucky. Miss Raven's name is Elena Valentine. She is the daughter of a family of capital merchants. She has unusual physical abilities, as well as a keen sense of combat. That's why no one dares to challenge her in hand-to-hand combat. She's now a second-year student at the academy and is an officer for her and the other classes in her year. Also, due to her abilities, she's already entering the battlefield as a chosen training soldier. Lilt pondered the idea of being a class officer and a chosen training soldier. Owen turned to the teacher and said he was hearing so many unfamiliar words. Gillen agreed with him. She suggested leaving the unfamiliar terms aside, as she was just about to explain the class officer. She suggested the students decide for themselves who would be the class officer. Gillen explained that the class officer is the person who represents their class and is its head. Simply put, a leader. They will take responsibility for progress, serve as a secretary for decisions, various presentations, other matters related to dissemination, and the like. This person will have a higher workload than other students. However, points will be added to the declared amount based on their attitude towards the role. Gillen explained that appointments to positions are made through a recommendation vote. One vote is equal to one person. This anonymous process will be repeated until fewer than 5 candidates remain. In the event of a tie, the candidates will compete against each other in person, and the winner will take the position of class officer. Gillen will resolve the battle if necessary. The rules allow for not voting, but voting for oneself is prohibited. The protagonist thought that class officer was a rather pompous title. In reality, it was simply an election for class president. The school would require not only skills but also leadership qualities to be recognized by others. The princess raised her hand and said she had a question. She asked if this meant that public voting was also permitted by the rules. Gillen answered yes. The princess stood up and declared that she, Malila Lee Lagustard, declared that her vote would remain blank. Everyone in the class was greatly surprised. Lilt wondered if the princess was deliberately making this public announcement. This could mean she was recommending herself. If someone else had done it, it would have been strange. But here, everything was already decided. Everyone knew the princess was capable and had charisma. And judging by the atmosphere in the classroom, everyone thought that if it was going to be the princess, then so be it. Lilt realized the result was clear, even without a vote. He wondered if the princess had always been such a far-sighted person. Gillen said it was an unusual case, but it did not violate the Academy's rules. Major General Gillen asked if anyone else had anything to say. Owen raised his hand and declared that he would cast one vote for Lilt. Princess Malila looked at the protagonist. Major General Gillen said, "That's it." The protagonist closed his eyes and clenched his teeth. Mentally, he scolded his comrade Owen for not feeling the atmosphere. Owen said he didn't want everyone to think he was unsure of the princess, but this school was a meritocracy, right? In that case, he believed Lilt was the best fit for the role. He had the highest grades in his class on exams and in class. Owen was confident no one would argue with that. Sarah raised her hand and said she wanted to vote for Lilt too. The protagonist was very surprised. Sarah said meritocracy was the right thing to do, and Lilt had very high stats. These were exactly the qualities a leader should possess. Sarah added that she had no intention of harming Her Highness. It was simply objective reasoning. Princess Malila replied that she understood everything. The protagonist thought he was glad for the recognition and honest assessment of his classmates, but he himself hadn't wanted to become class president. After all, he left the kingdom because he didn't like the heavy workload. His departure would be pointless if he was still overloaded with work here. But he couldn't hurt his classmates' trust, so Lilt raised his hand and said he would vote for Lady Malila. The protagonist agreed that he had good grades, but he felt he hadn't yet earned the class's trust, and Malila had all that. After all, she was the princess of the Gardardo Empire. Lilt loudly declared that there were such things as respect and admiration for the class leader. All of these concepts were characteristic of Lady Malila, so with her, the class would be calm. He was voting for her. Bella agreed. She believed that grades weren't the only thing that mattered, but also achievements, status, and popularity. She, too, was casting her vote for Lady Malila. The young man agreed with everyone and was voting for the princess. He said that the class leader was the face of the class. If you think about it that way, the princess was more suited for the position. Lilt secretly rejoiced at having stirred up trouble. Adolf expressed his point of view. He said he disagreed with voting for the princess. He casts his vote for Lilt. Adolf said that he was in this school because they didn't judge by appearance or background. He really wanted these principles to be preserved. The protagonist was surprised. Gillen thought that this vote was becoming like a debate. So far, everything was going smoothly, and she didn't mind hearing everyone's opinions. Gillen asked who else wanted to speak. One of the students raised her hand and said she was for the princess. The princess is elegant and noble. Another girl voted for the protagonist because he is strong. Another girl said she was voting for Princess Malila because the princess knows how to manage people. A young man said he was voting for the princess because she was sweet. Princess Malila mentally counted the votes and was glad that she was in the lead. The young man said he was for Lilt because the protagonist is modest. The young lady with the ears on her head said she was voting for Lady Malila. She really hoped the princess wouldn't be evil. Another student voted for Lilt. She thought he was the perfect target. The rock man said he was for Princess Malila because she was an aristocrat. The girl said she was for Lilt because he was a good fighter. The young man said he was also voting for Lilt because of the variable. The girl with 2 ponytails said she was voting for Lady Melilla because the princess was a workaholic. The girl with short hair said she was voting for Lilt because it would be more interesting. Major General Giln said there were 9 votes for Her Highness Melilla and 9 votes for Lilt. She said it had been a fierce battle, but there was one person left who hadn't voted. The protagonist began to panic. If the vote remained this way, he would have to fight the princess. He mentally begged the last person to vote for the princess. Giln said that only Geek hadn't voted. Lilt exhaled and thought, that's good. Geek would never allow Lilt to rise above him in status. Major General said there was no point in asking anonymously, so he should say it directly. What would his decision be? Geek raised his hand and said he refused to vote. Lilt didn't understand why. He knew Geek could have easily given his vote to the princess, but he deliberately sat silent until the very end. The protagonist didn't understand the point. Could Geek really do such a mean thing out of personal animosity? It was all written on his face. Giln said the voting was over. She said that Geek's decision hadn't changed the outcome. 9 votes for Princess Melilla and 9 votes for Lilt. The voting method had failed to select a class officer, and that meant there would be a decisive battle. Lilt versus Princess Melilla. This was the protagonist's fate, and now he couldn't escape. But there were also positive aspects to consider. This way, Lilt would get closer to the Imperial detachment. At this academy, it was possible to skip classes without attending classes. It turned out that so many students already trusted him, even though only a few days had passed since their meeting. He simply couldn't ignore their feelings, but he had to control himself to become a class officer. He had to take this seriously and fight to the bitter end. Suddenly, the princess said that it seemed like the protagonist had thought a lot but had made his decision. She said she wouldn't lose to him. Lilt smiled and told the princess to pity him. He noticed that the princess was more serious than she seemed. Was this an incomprehensible attitude? There was a high probability that the princess would become an officer even without campaigning. But the princess was active, and this was unlike her, as if she were in a hurry and worried about something. The protagonist wondered if there was something behind all this. Why was the princess so eager to become a class officer? The next day, the second underground floor of the kingdom's military officer academy. The most important thing here is the large training hall, widely known as the Underground Stadium. The Major General said there were only 22 applicants, 2 special classes, 20 spots. She wasn't sure everyone would pass. Giln announced that the duel between Lilt and Melilla would now begin. The officers' duel was about to begin. The princess did some arm exercises and said she never imagined they would find themselves competing in this situation. Lilt responded that it was indeed very strange. The princess said she didn't intend to lose to the protagonist, even though she knew he was very strong. She smiled and added that winning the duel and becoming an officer would be especially valuable to her. Lilt smiled back and told the princess to go easy on him. The protagonist thought that the princess's expectations for the duel were based on just one example, so there was no point dwelling on it anymore. It was better to simply focus on the current situation. He felt a slight discomfort in his stomach, but for the sake of the guys who had helped him so much, Lilt was determined to be the one to make it into the officer class. The Major General thought that their opponents were quite zealous, and that was great, but we need to see what happens next. Giln said that before the duel began, some rules needed to be explained. Owen asked again, rules? Isn't it obvious? Owen was sure it would be hand-to-hand combat. Giln replied that on the one hand, yes, but there were nuances. Princess Melilla, although in the same class as Lilt, was of royal descent. If Lilt inflicted serious injuries, it could lead to execution. Under normal circumstances, the fighting technique and the participants in the duel are the same, because for a warrior, the rules are important. But the main rule of this fight is to think about the participant. Sarah shouted, about the participant. The boys began to be indignant. How could this be? This was impossible. Even the princess herself was surprised by such rules. Suddenly, Iris appeared, holding balloons in her hand. She greeted everyone and said that not much time had passed. She was ready to jump with anticipation of the fight. All the observers sighed heavily. Iris said there was a tense atmosphere in the room. This was unexpected for someone like her. Iris sighed and said she'd explain the rules and go take a nap. Everyone thought she was offended. Iris turned and said that this time, Lilt and Melilla would compete in a balloon-popping game. First, they both needed to stand in designated spots. Then they needed to arrange the balloons, one balloon at a time. The duel would begin after the signal. The first person to pop a balloon wins. The allotted time for the competition was 90 minutes. Participants had to attack each other's balloons while simultaneously defending their own. This was a fight for officer rank, not just a struggle for status or superiority. All the observers agreed that Eris was right. Iris said they all made her angry because they were nervous. Okay, enough explaining. And about it being time for her to go to bed, she lied. She had a duty to be here as an observer. She would watch the fight and judge it alongside Ms. Giln. Iris lifted the hem of her dress and pulled out her broom from somewhere. She ordered the participants to take their positions and begin the duel. The observers couldn't understand where the broom had appeared in her hands. Iris asked them to stop asking such questions and not even blush. She said the students were still very new. She understood what was being inserted and where. The princess shouted for Lilt to start the duel quickly. She was afraid she couldn't stand any more of the teacher's comments. Giln raised her hand and announced again, Lilt versus Melilla, a duel for a place in the officer class. She asked them to take their positions. Get ready. Giln gave the command, begin, and lowered her hand. The opponents began releasing energy from their hands to defend themselves. Owen noticed that they released mana simultaneously. Adolf said Lilt had finished early. The protagonist was confused by the rules of the duel, as the balloon he had to protect was very easily burst. Any enemy attack, a stray shot, or a blow from a blind spot could cause harm. Even if he accidentally hit the balloon, it would burst and he would lose. Lilt decided to strengthen his defenses. He used protective earth magic, Gravedigger. Iris said it was the right decision, a reliable way to fight, just like it was written in the textbook. She said that right isn't always good. The princess used offensive magic, triple water lotus. Owen remembered that Bador used the same magic, but triple the power at the same time. After such a blow, Bador's dignity could not be restored. The princess knew that in a face-to-face clash she was weaker. She decided to act unfairly. She was confident that victory would be hers. She directed all her power at the enemy. Lilt realized he hadn't expected such a blow, but the princess had chosen a spell that required preparation. He had already finished building his defenses. The protagonist decided to erect a few more walls for protection. Owen was watching closely. Suddenly, he shouted for Lilt to be careful. The protagonist looked up and noticed the approaching energy. The blow struck Lilt's defensive wall, and everything was covered in smoke. Owen shouted his name. The princess said she was aiming for Lilt San himself. She uttered the saying, "If you want to kill a general, first kill his horse." She used a two-step trick and was able to win. She herself didn't expect Lilt to fall into her trap so quickly. The princess knew Lilt was stronger than her and didn't mind if the duel continued. She was ready to do anything to win. The princess continued to attack. She was ready to continue playing an aggressive style. The princess didn't want to leave her opponent a chance to win. The princess's balloon was guarded by an energy lotus, and there was a huge protective wall around the Lilt's balloon. Everyone stood and waited for the dust to settle to see what had happened to the protagonist. Owen dared to ask the princess about her killing Lilt. Melilla replied that Lilt San could certainly withstand such a blow. The princess panicked and ran toward the enemy's position. She was sure he was joking. She said she was ready to do anything to win, but she wasn't ready to take his life. At that moment, an energy beam shot out of the dust cloud and struck the water lotus directly. Shards of the shield flew in all directions, including the princess's head. Lilt's hands appeared from the dust cloud. He said that, as he thought, she hadn't been able to penetrate the shield. Then the dust cleared completely, and the protagonist himself appeared, without a single bruise or scratch. He had tried to shoot the fragments at the balloon under the cover of smoke, but he hadn't been able to aim. He hadn't even noticed the water lotus, let alone the balloon. Perhaps the balloon had an effect that prevented mana detection? Lilt was almost certain that was the case. His opponent had definitely thought out countermeasures in case of an attempt to detonate the balloon directly, especially since he had just taught the princess how to control mana outside of her body. Owen was glad Lilt was alive. He shouted that it was good that he was okay. He knew nothing could happen to him. He wondered how the protagonist had managed it. Lilt replied that everything had happened so quickly that he hadn't had time to use magic. It was a good thing he was into martial arts. The princess asked, "Lilt destroy it with his bare hands?" The princess said she understood that no one could be compared, but now she was losing confidence in her own abilities. Lilt replied that he shouldn't have done that because her magic was excellent, and if he hadn't chosen a defensive strategy, the princess would have definitely won. Lilt said that he couldn't be defeated so easily. He proudly declared that he had defeated the princess to become a class officer. The princess looked down and said, "Is that so?" The princess thought Lilt would retreat because of her status or position. The protagonist said that it was not worth building such optimistic expectations. He was convinced that the princess had also been thinking about their fight. The princess said this fight had weakened her. Frankly, her strategy was to surprise Lilt 2 or 3 more times. She understands that such tricks won't work on him anymore. All she can do is press forward. She used offensive ice magic, freezing rain. Lilt smiled and used earth magic, sandstorm. He was able to predict her move again. The onlookers noticed that the opponents were again casting spells simultaneously. But this time, Lilt also used offensive magic. The princess's spell was as good as Water Lotus. She truly was far more talented than many of the students. The princess had demonstrated her magical abilities many times. She is always confident in her magic, hence her feisty nature. It was necessary to make this a battle of attrition. Otherwise, the protagonist could lose. But despite everything, Lilt was only able to read the princess up to the point of creating a plan, meaning she understood his telepathic ability. The protagonist could predict how everything would end. The princess couldn't be allowed to dictate the battle's rhythm. Lilt had gained an advantage by reading the princess's mind. The princess unleashed a volley of 3 attack spells in a row: Blue Rose, Freezing Rain, and Ice Spikes. Rurito instantly activated his defense with Earth Flip, then used his body-strengthening technique, Steel Armor. The opponents stared at each other. Someone in the audience noticed that the princess was unleashing a barrage of spells on Lilt at a frantic pace. She wasn't giving the protagonist a chance to catch his breath. Adolf said that Lilt had calmly repelled all the attacks. The observers couldn't tell who was in the lead in this fight. It was impossible to tell because both combatants were so highly trained. Melilla prevented the protagonist from attacking, and he prevented her from breaking through. It was a perfect balance of power. Iris once again shouted at the observers not to push forward because it was dangerous. She erected a protective barrier. The balance of power was almost equal. But if anyone even slightly upset the delicate balance, the scales would tip in either direction. To secure victory, both sides would have to take risks, even if it was unwise. The one who gives 120% and goes beyond the limits of what is possible will win. Lilt cast another protective earth spell, a dirty move. The princess was a little confused. A huge earthen hand was moving toward her, and chunks of dirt were falling to the floor. Owen was shocked that Lilt had attacked first. The princess gathered her strength and realized that the protagonist wanted to crush both her and the balloon at once. Could this be retaliation for her previous spells? Despite the hand's size, it was just dirt. How could dirt be reliable? The princess used her water lotus. The lotus pierced the mud hand and instantly froze it. A cracking and crunching sound could be heard. The mud hand began to shatter into pieces. Someone onlooker said the princess had simply frozen her hand and shattered it completely. She calculated everything so that not a single fragment hit her balloon. The onlookers couldn't understand how she could react so quickly. Melilla said Lilt was naive to think such a thing could stop her. Lilt replied that he hadn't really expected it. He instantly jumped out from behind the crumbling shards of frozen mud. Owen shouted, "What a twist!" He was glad the protagonist had launched a frontal attack. Lilt hadn't expected the dirty trick to succeed from the start. It had simply been a distraction. He'd simply waited for the slightest inattention and then launched an attack. Here it is, the treasured balloon. He just had to reach out for it, but something went wrong. The princess laughed and said that she had only demonstrated attack magic before. No wonder he had been wrong about her strengths. The princess proudly declared that her true specialty was defensive magic. She had already cast the protective spell, Goddess's Veil. The onlookers couldn't believe the princess had unleashed such a powerful spell in a second. She had cast such power and with such precision. They realized that Lilt had risked everything, but had failed to penetrate the princess's defense. The protagonist cursed. All the princess had to do was knock down the unprotected balloon, and that's it. The princess aimed for a precise shot. Strength was not necessary now, speed was what mattered. The main thing was to get there before the protagonist could put up another defense. The princess thought she needed to aim precisely. There was a crack, and a small ice ball flew out of the princess's finger. One shot, one hit. Lilt dove back to protect his ball. He managed to outpace the flying ice ball and deflect it with his hand at the last moment. Owen shouted with joy for his comrade. The general and instructor were also very worried. The princess was shocked by his speed. A girl from the class asked the stone man if he saw it too. The boy replied, yeah. He could hardly believe it all happened before their eyes. Owen said that Lilt outpaced the magical charge and deflected it. Everyone watching was shocked. The princess admitted that Lilt was a strong opponent. She said it was simply impossible. To pull off such a feat with such precision in such a situation was simply incredible. She realized that the protagonist had just stood next to her and was in the same state as she was. Many people didn't understand what it was and how it happened. Someone asked about starting over. Lilt replied, no, not really. The princess fell to her knees, exhausted. The onlookers were surprised. The princess replied that nothing serious had happened, just a slight magical deficiency. The crowd asked again, magic deficiency? Instructor Iris said it wasn't surprising if the students hadn't experienced it before. Magic always circulates in the body, but when it's suddenly depleted, its concentration plummets. As a result, the body loses a vital element. Dizziness, headaches, and fatigue occur. This is magical deficiency. Iris said that such an effect cannot be achieved intentionally, no matter how hard one tries. Magic volume, circulation, and the efficiency of its use are all individual. These indicators differ from person to person, so it's impossible to predict exhaustion. Lilt confirmed the instructor's words. He said that he had structured the entire fight so that he expended less magic than his opponent. The rules of the duel are designed to compensate for differences in physical strength. Therefore, it was logical that the one with more magic would win. Lilt admitted that he'd been relying on his fists from the start. More precisely, he'd relied not only on magic but also on his muscles, and it worked. The princess was surprised that he'd calculated everything and that everything had gone according to plan. She said it wasn't admirable, but frightening. Lilt was surprised that the princess had recovered faster than he expected. He said the princess was flattering him, as he was almost out of magic. He had one more attack left, but he didn't want to waste it. He discreetly picked up a piece of mud shard and rushed at the princess. Lilt declared that it was time to end the duel. The princess agreed. When the protagonist ran past the princess, she aimed at his balloon. She shouted that she too still had the strength for one more try. She focused on the balloon, but didn't manage to fire. Something black appeared in front of the princess and pulled her hand away. The princess was terrified. Lilt said he hadn't wanted to use it, but he had no choice. He had foreseen this development and prepared in advance. Lilt cast a bind and hold spell. He apologized to the princess for his impudence in restricting the mobility of a member of the royal family in such a way. He knew it was sheer sacrilege, but he had no choice. The princess understood what he meant when he said he had one more attack in store. Melilla once again called the protagonist amazing. She admitted that further resistance would only be shameful. The princess conceded defeat. Lilt swung at the balloon behind the princess and threw a stone. The balloon burst. Princess Melilla said she had lost. The major general said it. That's all. Some of the spectators were overjoyed. The other half stood there, upset. Giln loudly declared that victory was Lilt's. She said she and Iris would waste no time and presented him with the class officer badge. Giln declared that, from today on, Lilt was the class officer. The protagonist accepted the badge. Iris approached him and asked if he had gotten scared at the last moment. Lilt smiled and answered no. He said he felt joy. After all, he had earned the victory through his own hard work. He took seriously the fact that only half the class had voted for him. He resolved to earn the trust of the other students through his actions in the future. Lilt proudly declared that he intended to work hard for this and was ready to give it his all. He hoped for the support of the other students and was ready to work together. Someone in the crowd said that after such a fight, no one would even argue. Someone had said the protagonist had proven his worth, and they couldn't understand what complaints there could be. They understood perfectly well that this place was created for such trials. Lilt was worried about how those who voted for the princess would react to his victory, but now he saw that everything was in order and there was no turning back. Moreover, he was happy with the outcome of the fight. Suddenly, the princess's voice interrupted all his thoughts. She said that since everything had already been discussed, wasn't it time to free her? Lilt was afraid he had forgotten to free the princess. Iris had seen everything, but she deliberately remained silent. Lilt apologized and said he would take everything off now. The princess replied that everything was fine and asked him to give her his hand.